Thank you, and welcome to Microsoft Virtualization for VMware Professionals. So, what are we going to be talking about? Well, this is a 3-day training course. We've broken it down into a lot of modules, and really our goal is to just kind of talk about virtualization, but really with a focus on Microsoft, kind of understanding Microsoft's offerings, our platforms, and all of our different solutions, both in the server space, the desktop, the application, really kind of touching on all of these different Microsoft technologies. And we certainly hope to give some good demonstrations as well. Not only just tell you about the technologies, but show you how all of them work and how they all work together. I think Microsoft's management suite, its integration, those are two of the really strong points that we have here. So we really want to show you some of that interoperability as well with the System Center suite.
Let me kind of throw a quick point in there. One of the questions, and like as we've socialized this event over the last month or so, one of the questions that's come up a lot is, what makes this a clinic for VMware guys, right? What is specific about it? And we do have some direct terminology comparisons, but I kind of want to set the stage a little bit to make sure that you know what we're here to do, and also what we're not here to do. The background that I come from is very broad and very mixed. I don't work for Microsoft. I have an independent consulting company. We do a lot of work for Microsoft, but also for many other companies as well, including Citrix, for example. And so one of the things that I've been doing, if I kind of go back and look at my history in virtualization, when I first began working with commercial level virtualization in enterprises and larger companies back 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, anything that was large scale was on VMware. And then eventually we had some smaller pilot sort of things that ran on virtual server, and even some large deployments that ran on virtual server. As we moved forward and Hyper-V began to be released, the first release of Hyper-V admittedly was lacking in a couple of key areas, and it was questioned for enterprise readiness because of some of the key features. It was kind of fell short on. I don't know if that's the right term to use, but that weren't there in that first release.
Sure.
You've got to kind of draw a line in the sand at some stage, and they did that, and some of the features weren't there in the first release. But as we've kind of come forward, there's been a big change in the way that my customers are approaching this. Initially it was, if I'm virtualizing, it's going on VMware, and there was a little bit of other things everywhere else. About 2 years ago, I started working very heavily in VDI. And so that put me on a Zen platform primarily. And so we did a lot of work on Zen platform. Primarily Zen desktop running on Zen servers. One of the things that I've begun doing in the last couple of years as well is working with Microsoft and Citrix jointly on some of their partnership initiatives. And so we went around the country for roughly the last 18 months doing kind of readiness clinics, if you would. And so what we do is take partners and companies that wanted to do VDI, and they had originally been planning on doing it either on VMware or on Zen, and now their management's saying, we want to evaluate all the hypervisors because, let's face it, today you've got VMware, you've got Zen, you've got Hyper-V, and they're all pretty much on par. I mean, every one of them has little things that it can claim against the other, but the bulk of them the feature set is very, very, very comparable. The performance is very comparable. It comes down to factors beyond what we would have traditionally thought. If you look back at VMware versus virtual server back in those days. That they're all very, very similar. So now what they want their IT departments to do is evaluate all three. And so we're doing a lot of these kind of clinics where the people that are coming in are very strong on VMware, very strong on Citrix, but didn't know anything about Hyper-V and Windows.
Right.
Other than your typical IT admin, Active Directory, DNS, that sort of stuff. And so when we put together this clinic, it's an educational clinic. This is not, a marketing smackdown. We're not here to go, here's a VMware server, here's a Hyper-V server, look, one's faster, because, you can make anything.
There's bias always.
Yeah, and you can make it look however you want.
Exactly, yep.
So instead what we kind of did is took, what are the topics around the Microsoft virtualization solution that the typical guy who's been, entrenched with VMware for the last 3 or 4 years doesn't really know a lot about, or hasn't had the exposure to, or maybe has some misconceptions on. And so while we're going to sit here and do some comparisons in terms of terminology because we want you to be able to speak the language, but we're not here to sit here and put things side by side and go, look, see how bad this is and see how good this is. It'd be unfair to be biased, and quite frankly, it'd ruin any of our credibility. But what we did do is pick the topics that the VMware guys typically have not had the exposure to and not had the training on and have misconceptions around. And haven't had the chance to train literally hundreds and hundreds of people in the last 2 years. I think we've got a pretty good selection done here. We certainly are not touching everything that Microsoft does in virtualization.
Right.
We're not touching any of the desktop virtualization technologies, and I'm not referring to VDI. That's a different topic entirely, but things like virtual PC and MEDV and these desktop level technologies. And we're also focusing on the topics that the data center guys want to hear the most about around clustering. That's a big one. Strong background of years, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about clustering, high availability, and how that all works. A lot of time on the integrated management stack, and then a lot of time on the VDI solution, because there's some confusion around that that we typically find, because it's a joint Microsoft Citrix implementation, not a joint Microsoft VMware implementation. That'd be kind of strange. But
now you've mentioned VDI a few times. Can you define that acronym just in case some people out there aren't familiar with it?
Virtual desktop infrastructure.
Okay.
Right. Virtual desktop infrastructure. So let's continue on here.
So let's talk a little more about what we're going to be covering. So today we're going to be covering the infrastructure. Basically, we're trying to put together all of the pieces that kind of made the foundation of your data center. So we're going to give an introduction to virtualization, Microsoft's virtualization solutions. Then we're going to cover some of the terminology and kind of have, I don't want to say a feature comparison, but kind of a terminology comparison, just so when we're talking our language, you can kind of relate what that means. You know what a vMotion is, you know what it does, but we call that a live migration. That kind of analysis, that kind of trade-off. Then we're going to spend a lot of time really talking about core Hyper-V, the core virtualization infrastructure, understanding how to deploy Hyper-V, how it's configured, how it works with storage, networking, and how to manage it. And then we're going to move on to my favorite topic, clustering and high availability. I spent 4 years on the cluster team as one of the designers of many of the features, so it's my baby and I love it. So we're going to spend a couple hours talking about all of that. Now, why is that important? Well, high availability is putting all the pieces together, is connecting all of the servers, making sure that they can interact with each other. And really, that gives you the VM mobility. It allows you to move your virtual machines around the entire data center with no downtime. So it's a very critical piece of having this virtualized, this dynamic data center, this private cloud that a lot of people are talking about.
If you're building high availability for virtualization, there's a lot more at stake than what you would have traditionally built for a file server, an email server, or a database. And so that's why there's such an emphasis on this and making sure that it's a comfort zone for everybody. So,
absolutely.
Good point.
Now, as we move on to our second day tomorrow, first we're going to start by talking about System Center. System Center is our integrated management suite. It covers everything from managing your virtual machines to deployments to just ensuring that your operations are running. We have some great integrated workflows with Opalis, with Service Manager. So really, System Center is our all-encompassing management product that's going to manage all parts of your data center, whether it's the servers, the VDI clients, or even the cloud.
Absolutely. Module 7, if you look at the timing of this particular event, it's the week following MMS, and it was done that way deliberately because we can actually now officially talk about VMM 2012.
And it's awesome. I can't wait.
Yeah, there's such a phenomenal change from VMM 2008 to VMM 2012 in terms of the scope of what this product does, that it's critical in moving forward and looking at what Microsoft's strategy and solution is, that we take into consideration VMM 2012. So we've got quite a great deal of content specifically on that. So if you're tuned in for VMM 2012, we've got a couple of hours. We've got some pretty cool demos we're going to do. It's still in beta, so do the best we can.
Keep that in mind.
But certainly we've made a very concerted effort to include a lot of material around VMM 2012. Module 8 deals with private cloud architecture and the self-service portal 2.0. There's a lot of confusion in the industry in general around what private cloud is.
Right.
I had a neighbor of mine who's in IT literally 3 or 4 days ago come to me and go, what is the cloud? Can I buy that? And there's just so much general confusion because everybody's definition of private cloud is different.
Right.
And you have all these companies out there that are building their version of private cloud, telling you it's right and someone else's is wrong. And this is not, limited to Microsoft and VMware. This is across the industry in general. Everybody's got their version of private cloud. So we'll talk about what Microsoft's version of private cloud is, their strategy, what are the components that make it up, and VMM 2012 becomes a big part of that moving forward. Day 3, I call this my day.
It's the Corey show, right?
This is the Corey show. This is one of the things I do primarily nowadays is VDI. It's a big emerging technology. It's coming kind of into its own in the last year or two. It's been around in various forms for a long time, but this notion of it being easy, relatively cost-effective, and relatively safe to put a desktop in the data center and remotely access it with proper management tools, is a concept that more and more people are starting to adopt. So we're going to talk about VDI in general. For most people that come from a data center virtualization background, this is a big shift, right? The way you think about building the hosts, building the environment, the way you think about simple things like disk I/O and bandwidth change when you deal with VDI. Because you go from having a smaller quantity of high resource servers to massive quantities of low resource desktops. And so you've got to think about a lot of different things there, right? And a simple example is when a server is running and just performing a workload, and if you take like an Exchange server or a SQL server or even a SharePoint server, when they're booted and running, they're generally not that hard on disk.
Right.
When you get into VDI, one of the problems that people run into is something called a boot storm, where they decide, in the morning, let's boot all our virtual
Everything
desktops.
comes up at the same time,
and
yeah.
the number of, I remember Mark Rusinovich did a white paper on this, and I attempted to find the link, but I couldn't, a little while back, that talked about the number of IOPS required to boot a Windows desktop. And it's phenomenally larger than the number required to run a Windows desktop. So you've got to take a lot of different things into consideration nowadays. If you have a server running as a VM on a virtualization host, you're not likely to sit on that and browse the web. So you're not likely to run into all the bad things that can happen when you browse the web. With a virtual desktop, you are. I've had customers that have had, VDI implementations grind to a halt because users browsed the web and were looking at, little JavaScript games that, moved bubbles around, and something was wrong and it pegged the CPU across an entire suite of desktops, and it ground everything to a halt. So there's a lot of considerations. So we'll spend 2 sections dealing with the architecture, the design. How do you approach thinking about VDI?
Right.
And this is the sort of information that, quite frankly, you can apply anywhere, right? It's not vendor specific per se. The challenges, the problems, the design considerations, they're going to be the same no matter what the implementation is. Module 11 talks about Microsoft's implementation, their enterprise implementation of VDI. And for Microsoft, it's a joint offering in conjunction with Citrix. It involves Citrix Zen Desktop running on Hyper-V managed by System Center. And a lot of people kind of ask, why? Why Citrix and Microsoft? Citrix has a hypervisor. Microsoft has built into Server 2008 R2 a VDI stack. Why are they partnered up? What's the better together story? So we'll talk about that. And then finally,
that's known as the V-Alliance.
Yeah, exactly. It's known as the V-Alliance. And then Module 12 is application delivery. So, Windows is fine. Windows runs extremely fast on very little hardware until you add applications. And the way that you approach application delivery for VDI drastically affects kind of that holy grail, which is density. How many desktops can I run on a server? And so we'll talk about some strategy and what you do there and how that would generally work.
Great. So why don't you talk more about our demo environment? You're the hardware guy. You set it up. You're the expert. Tell us about it.
Absolutely. So we wanted to try and, a lot of times when people do these things, they grab a laptop and they throw some software on a laptop. When they asked me to help participate, I said, you know what, I will, but I want some proper hardware. And so we did. We got some good hardware. We have a 4-node cluster that's running on an 8-gig fiber channel SAN.
Pretty nice.
Yeah,
is it fast?
It's incredibly fast. The write time is just over a gig a second.
Wow.
That's
pretty solid.
It's blazingly fast. 72 gigs of RAM per node. A couple of networks are in there. And then we've configured bare metal management. So these are from memory Dell server, so it would be the iDRAC interface that we've configured. And that matters because VMM 2012 will now manage using those bare metal protocols. So it'll actually talk to the iDRAC implementation and do things like remote power management, look at the hardware logs so you can see if there's a fan failing. I mean, all sorts
Very
of fun
cool.
stuff.
Yeah.
We're using a toolkit which is actually going to be available for partners in the near future called the Enterprise Reference Data Center.
ERDC.
Yeah, which is a collection of about 30 pre-configured VMs that represents, most of the System Center and Forefront product lines pre-configured, pre-installed, functional, ready to use. And it's designed for POCs and demos and just to kind of get that integrated story off the ground because you've done it, I've done it. It takes a long time to build complex infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And then so some examples of things we have here. We've got some domain controllers, some System Center configuration managers, SCOM, service managers in there, Opalis is in there. Opalis is a fun topic because for a lot of folks, it's sort of a new acquisition from Microsoft. And a lot of the folks that traditionally work in data center automation are not necessarily as familiar with this.
Right.
But it's a phenomenal product.
It's really cool, yeah.
So we've got Operations Manager in there twice, apparently, according to the slide. Really only once. We've got Virtual Machine Manager and Data Protection Manager. Data Protection Manager in particular is set up right now protecting the cluster at the VM level. So it's actually integrated with Hyper-V, not with the guest.
You can back up running VMs as well,
Exactly.
right? There's no downtime
There's no
involved.
downtime, and you've got some pretty neat restore options, which we'll talk about when we do that particular section. The primary management layer is VMM 2012 right now. So we opted to just put that down. It's managing the cluster, managing all the machines in the cluster. And then we've got a Xen server because VMM 2012 will actually manage Xen. So we'll be taking a look at that a bit later on as well.
Great. Well, I want to mention that all of these videos will be recorded and available for later viewing in the Microsoft Virtual Academy. Now, this was just launched last week during MMS conference, and it's basically a one-stop shop to go learn everything about virtualization. So if you want to take these courses again, if you want to learn more things, you want some strategy about private cloud, just go check it out. It's completely free. There's a built-in point system, so over time, the more courses you do, you can earn rewards. So it's just a really great way to just kind of understand all of Microsoft's offerings, both in the server area as well as the cloud. So check it out at microsoftvirtualacademy.com for more information. And again, it's completely free, so just sign up, check it out. And with that, we're going to wrap up the first module, and we're going to jump into module number 1 with our virtualization overview. Now, with this module, virtualization overview, essentially, we're just going to talk about Microsoft's strategy, Microsoft's vision of what virtualization means, from the desktop to the cloud to the data center. We don't really just focus on one area because virtualization, it's a large topic. It just covers everything that you have, all of the devices, all of the products, your whole data center. So really it's important just to kind of understand where we fit in, our strategy, and our approach. Now, what we really want to help you understand as part of this module is just understand where is Microsoft coming from? What products do we have? How long have we been doing this? And while Hyper-V is somewhat new in the virtualization game, when we start to look at the feature set compared to Citrix, compared to VMware, it's pretty much a parity now. Now, that certainly wasn't the case, even 2 years ago, before Server 2008 R2 came out. There were admittedly some deficiencies, so it's really nice in this last release to kind of see it come up a little.
Yeah, I think in Hyper-V R1, the big shortfall was around the area of high availability. And around the area of clustering, and it sort of hanging off of that was the notion of they didn't have live migration. So that particular feature set of live migration, cluster shared volumes, really elevated it quite a bit from R1 to R2. And a lot of the customers that I was dealing with at the time, that kind of said, "Yeah, fine, looks great. Talk to me at the next version." When that came along, the conversation moved along really, really quickly.
Right.
Obviously, with SP1 now introducing dynamic memory, that's another big feature set as well, and that's a feature that's particularly useful in VDI scenarios.
And we're going to be talking more about dynamic memory in Module 3, and more about live migration and cluster shared volumes in Module 4. And those are our equivalents to vMotion and VMFS. Now, why Microsoft Virtualization? Okay, we're going to give a brief sales pitch, so bear with us, and then we're going to turn it all over on the technical side.
Well, I realize you use the term sales pitch. And it's important to note that, you know, a lot of people, when we come to these things, you know, they kind of got this bad vision in their head that, oh, you know, it's the marketing slide, then just tune out. Don't tune out for the marketing slide, because most of you guys probably at some stage have to turn around and convince your boss to do this.
Right.
And
if
nothing else, you can repitch them some of this. So yeah, there's some big picture value stuff. There's some, you know, what you might consider sales and marketing. But at the end of the day, that's also useful data. So.
You still need to, yeah, be able to sell it to your boss, to your team, to your company.
Absolutely.
And so why Microsoft? Well, I mean, the first reason is, you know Microsoft, right? You use it at home, use it on your phone. You're familiar with it. You probably use Active Directory in your entire environment already. So you kind of have a single set of tools, you know, that can have advantage. You're working with one single vendor for support. You're working with one single vendor for sales. There's a lot of benefits of having this integrated solution throughout the whole stack. Now, another great thing that we do is we cover the entire suite of virtualization products, from the desktop, the data center, the cloud. And all of that can be managed using System Center. System Center is a great product. This past week, they just announced a lot of the 2012 releases at MMS. System Center Virtual Machine Manager, it's awesome, it rocks. You know, it's not just managing your VMs anymore, it's managing all of the resources, these resource pools. Can just create a cluster using VMM now. I mean, really cool integration there.
Probably my single favorite feature, and I was privileged enough, I had VMM 2012 when it was in what was called Customer Technology Preview, which is the pre-beta version. And the first thing I did is I went into one of my data centers, and I'm looking through and I go, what's that feature? And what I did literally within 10 minutes was I took a rack of 20 bare metal machines and had Hyper-V running in a domain with the agent on them, literally in about, I think it was 15 to 20 minutes total, using the bare metal deployment that's baked into VMM now. So you can take machines that have nothing on them that come pre-configured with, you know, things like if it's HP, it's ILO, if it's Dell, it's iDirect. Those are the two that I deal with 99% of the time, so I'll keep referring to them. But certainly it will take bare metal machines, deploy the OS, right? So part of VMM is now deploying the hypervisor, not just deploying the agent that manages the hypervisor. Right. And that's a phenomenal capability that certainly we'll be taking a look at.
Now, you know, back to the management, right? No, we're managing physical now, we're managing virtual, we're managing the apps in the guest. You know, I guess one of our big stories, right, we're not just about managing the server, right? We're about managing the apps, seeing what the apps are doing, monitoring the apps, making sure they're healthy. And not just based on the state of the server where we do changes, but based on how the app's doing. If it needs more resources, if you know, it's spiking on the server, we could go and move things around. So it's kind of that end-to-end management, you know, both the metal, the virtualization layer, as well as the app that I think really makes it a powerful story.
Absolutely.
And then, you know, I'm not a sales guy, so I'm going to avoid saying cost, but from the data that we've looked at, independent studies as well, people are saying that Microsoft Virtualization is a third the price to a sixth of the price. Now, that's pretty much all we're going to talk about as far as the financial data. Plenty of resources out there if you want to go and look into it, but we're technical guys. Let's focus on the technology
Absolutely.
For this presentation. So as we look at the overview, we've kind of talked about this data center, desktop, the cloud, all of it encompassed by our management solution. And you know, just having this kind of single integrated story, I think gives you a lot of power, right? You're not going to all of these different vendors. You don't need all these different support contracts. You don't need to speak to all these different sales folks. Go to a single shop. Microsoft's going to take care of you. And so server virtualization, that's kind of my favorite. That's where I came from with the high availability, with the clustering background. And this is essentially just putting all of your servers in individual VMs. You get the benefits of isolation. You know, you get the benefits of just easy management, spinning up VMs. And with the System Center product, it was really initially designed for the server, so it's got great end-to-end management throughout that. Now, desktop virtualization, I'm going to turn that over to you. That's your specialty.
It is, and I will say that what's on the slide there is desktop virtualization, not virtual desktop infrastructure. And so let's clarify that for a second. What most people think of as VDI involves taking, Windows 7, potentially Windows XP, although it should be Windows 7. Windows 7 is designed with VDI in mind. Putting it in a VM, putting it on a server, and then connecting to it with a remote protocol, be it ICA, RDP, or something else. Desktop virtualization is running a client-side virtual machine, so a virtual machine running on this laptop right here. And there are still use cases for that, and there are still companies that are doing that. They're primarily around compatibility. So if I want to deploy an application that simply will not run on Windows 7, but I still want Windows 7, I can run it within a VM running Windows XP, running on Windows 7. And there are tools like MedV that will streamline that across an enterprise. Now, we're not touching that. That's not within scope of what we're doing here. So you can certainly go learn more about it, but that's not one of the topics we're going to talk a lot about. Presentation virtualization is one. Now, when we talk about presentation virtualization, this is your traditional terminal server experience. Now, I'm going to use the term terminal server generically. It could be, remote desktop services, which is what it's called in R2. It could be, terminal service, which was what it was called previous to R2. Or it could be, if you're a Citrix deployment, it could be using a XenApp implementation for it. It doesn't matter. We'll just call it a terminal server. What's interesting about this is I'm seeing more terminal server deployments today as a result of the requests that come in for VDI.
Really?
It is.
How come you're seeing that big increase?
It's an interesting little scenario, because most people that come to me and say, hey, Corey, I've heard about this thing called VDI, I want VDI. When we sit down and do the business case analysis, VDI is not what they want. What they need is an application they can remote into somehow.
Right.
And they've seen VDI as the solution to that. Well, there's way simpler, easier, cheaper, and less complicated ways of achieving that than VDI. So it comes down to analyzing, what's the legitimate problem that they're trying to solve. And a lot of my, I want VDI questions wind up in a terminal server implementation of some sort, because it solves the same problem. And it does it with greater density and less complexity and a lower cost. So yeah, I've actually seen a bit of a resurgence of this in recent years as a spin-off of VDI and as an alternative to VDI for folks that think they want it, but the business case doesn't justify it.
So tell me about application virtualization as well.
Application virtualization, which in Microsoft the product is AppV, involves, and if you haven't played with this, it's a tricky concept. We'll be dealing with it as the very last module, this whole thing in 2 days from now, so on Thursday afternoon. And it's actually a topic that is very popular with the VDI industry and the folks that come in and are looking at doing VDI. And essentially what it means is, if you think back to the good old days, I'm going to reveal my age here, of like DOS. If you had DOS and you had a program, you had a little directory and you had a program in there and you wanted to copy the program to another computer, you just copied the directory and you could actually go ahead and run the program. AppV is kind of getting you to almost that level of a state where you take an application, rather than installing the application in the machine, you install the application in an authoring workstation called a sequencer. And what it produces is a package that represents the installed application. That installed application is a folder, and you can put that folder on a machine and run the app.
So it means people don't have to go install it locally.
Exactly.
Anyway.
It's completely disconnected from the OS. You can go in, delete it, remove it, reapply it, update it, have multiple versions of the same application at the same time. It was phenomenal. It was originally built for terminal server implementations, where I had a farm of terminal servers and I wanted to run multiple versions of Office. It was kind of like the original use case for this. So how do I run 2 versions of Office in isolation on the same machine and patch them in one location?
Right.
And so you take that, that's the model we see in VDI. You can also deliver it down to desktops as well. And there's a lot of other, it's a big solution that covers a lot of things.
Very cool. And of course, all of these are managed by System Center.
Absolutely.
We have this single integrated product, streamlines everything. And so having that, single vendor, single product that takes care of everything, pretty nice, right?
Absolutely.
Pretty nice end-to-end story. So applications. Now, I think one of the important things about Microsoft and their solution, we don't just monitor the hardware, we don't just care about the hardware, the virtualization platform, but it's about the apps as well.
Absolutely. I mean, if you go in there and you have an implementation that you've got to do, and it's, you know, it's an Exchange server. The suite of applications that you have within System Center doesn't care if it's a virtual Exchange server or a physical Exchange server. And that applies across the board. It doesn't matter. It's simply an implementation of Exchange. And it will work with it in the same way, interact with it in the same way, back it up in the same way, monitor it in the same way, regardless of where the application actually runs. So it's a huge benefit. It's a huge advantage that the way you look at both the hardware layer, the virtualization layer, the application layer, the end users, the desktops, doesn't change. The physical implementation, whether it's virtual or physical, becomes irrelevant.
And I mean, I'll speak coming from the product team. It was absolutely critical for us when we were doing our development, when we were doing our design, that we didn't just test on bare metal. We had to test everything running in that virtualized environment as well. Because just having that great end-to-end story, you know, really you shouldn't care whether you're running on a physical server or running in a virtualized environment. It shouldn't matter to you, but it should work really well in both cases.
You get back to the notion of, you know, we talk about private cloud a lot. And what is private cloud? And you know, and one of the key cornerstones of private cloud is the notion that the hardware becomes invisible. You have a workload that represents an application. That workload gets provisioned into a computer, right? And it's a virtual computer. And that virtual machine has a set of hardware associated with it, a set of resources it consumes, processor, RAM, disk, etc. But you don't know or care where that physically lives at any point in time.
And you shouldn't, right?
No, exactly.
As we move to this private cloud idea, everything's under the covers. You just have your app, it just works.
Once upon a time, you know, if you were an Exchange admin, you had to care about the hardware. If you were a SQL admin, you had to care about the hardware because you built the server, you built the OS, and a lot of times, you know, it was all part of your responsibility. Nowadays, it's separating it. It's creating this layer that's invisible to you that just represents resources you can consume.
Absolutely, and I mean, Target, they just announced last week at MMS that they're going and deploying Hyper-V in over 1,700 stores, 15,000 VMs. So I mean, that's a great proof of concept that we really do scale. And I mean, you know, we work well not just with our, you know, kind of end users, but really well with our partners as well. I think our interoperability story is really important. Yeah,
one of the key things is that most of these products, they're not limited to a Hyper-V virtualization stack. That, you know, if it's a virtualization stack that's been approved, and there's a program called the Server Virtualization Validation Program, it's supported on, you know, any hypervisor virtualization stack that there is. So it's certainly, the flexibility is there. You're not required to run SQL on Hyper-V, for example. You can run SQL on VMware. You can run SQL on Xen if you want to. It's perfectly fine. From the standpoint of the application doesn't care.
Very cool. And one thing we want to point out, you know, we do have a lot of additional resources out there. Our virtualization blogs, our TechNet library. Microsoft.com is one of the most visited sites on the internet. Oh, and it's running on Hyper-V, of course.
Absolutely.
Over 1 billion page requests a month.
Well, so are MSDN and TechNet, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, they are, absolutely. So a lot of resources out there for you to use. We do have a lot of training as well. While there's the whole Microsoft Certified Professional program, Certified Admin, Certified Data Center Admin, so a lot of variety. So if you really want some training that also comes with an end credential, something nice that you can put on a resume, you know, something that you can leverage and actually use to try to advance your career.
Absolutely.
Microsoft Certification has a lot of offerings out there. So we're just going to wrap up this module. I mean, what are the key things that we wanted to point out here? Interoperability. We care not just about the platform, but about the apps. And virtualization, we manage everything, right? From the apps to the data center to the cloud. So a lot of variety.
And just in case you're wondering, it gets a lot more technical from here.
It does.